You really think you can just wear that here? The voice cut sharp across the training field, slicing through the dry Texas heat like a blade. Staff Sergeant Ryan Blake didn't wait for an answer. His boot stopped inches from the old man, eyes locked on the faded patch stitched crookedly onto a worn olive jacket. Around them, a dozen young soldiers slowed their drills, their attention drifting, curiosity rising like heat waves off the asphalt. Ethan Cole didn't move. He stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture neither defensive nor proud, just steady. The wind tugged lightly at the loose threads of that patch, its colors long since dulled, its edges frayed by time that no one here understood. Blake smirked, glancing back at his squad as if inviting an audience. "What is this, some kind of costume piece?" he said, reaching out before anyone could stop him. His fingers brushed the patch, then gripped it, tugging it loose with a careless yank. The fabric tore softly, a quiet sound that somehow carried farther than it should have. A few of the soldiers chuckled. One let out a low whistle. The patch dropped, landing in the dust between Blake's boots. "Stolen valor," Blake muttered, grinding it lightly into the ground with a slow twist of his heel. The laughter spread, uneven at first, then louder as the moment stretched. But Ethan didn't react. Not the way they expected. No anger. No protest. His gaze lowered, not to Blake, but to the patch now half buried in dirt, as if the world around him had gone silent. For a moment, the base seemed to breathe differently. A gust of wind rolled across the open field, rattling loose gravel, carrying with it the distant hum of engines and the faint metallic clink of equipment. Somewhere off to the side, Specialist Noah Carter froze. He had been watching from behind a line of stacked crates, his brow tightening the second the patch hit the ground. Something about it felt wrong. Not just old, not just worn, different. His eyes narrowed, heart picking up in a way he couldn't explain. He stepped closer, just enough to see the symbol clearly beneath the dust. And then he stopped, completely. His breath caught, shoulders stiffening as recognition, faint, distant, but unmistakable, pulled at something deep in his memory. Blake didn't notice. He was still talking, still playing to the small crowd gathering behind him. "We've got standards here," he said, folding his arms, voice louder now. "You don't just walk onto a U.S. Army base wearing whatever you want and expect respect." A few nods, a few smirks, but the energy had shifted. Subtle, uneasy, like the air before a storm. Ethan finally moved. Slow, deliberate. He bent down, ignoring Blake completely, and reached for the patch. His fingers hovered over it for a fraction of a second before lifting it gently from the dirt. He brushed it once, twice, careful, almost reverent. And when he stood back up, his eyes didn't meet Blake's. They looked past him, far beyond the training field, beyond the noise, beyond the present. As if he were standing somewhere else entirely. And somewhere behind them, a radio clicked to life, followed by a voice that didn't sound casual at all. The radio crackled again, louder this time, sharp enough to cut through the low murmur spreading across the training field. And Specialist Noah Carter swallowed hard as he stepped back, his fingers tightening around the device like it suddenly carried weight, real weight, the kind that made his pulse climb. "Command, this is Carter. I need immediate verification on a unit insignia." His voice was controlled, but just barely. And across from him Blake scoffed, rolling his eyes as if the whole thing had become a joke dragged too far. "What are you doing, Specialist? Calling this in like it matters." But Carter did not answer, his eyes still locked on the patch in Ethan Cole's hand, watching the way the older man held it. Not like fabric, not like decoration, but like something that had survived decades without ever needing to explain itself. And for a moment the sounds of boots on gravel and distant drills seemed to fade into the background as the reply came through the radio. Quieter now, but carrying a tone that shifted everything. "Repeat that insignia." The voice said, slower this time, careful, and Carter described it. Every detail he could see, the worn stitching, the faded symbol, the shape that did not belong to any current division listed in his training manuals. And there was a pause, a long one. The kind that stretched just enough to make the air feel heavier. And Blake laughed again, louder now, turning to the others as if to reclaim control of the moment. "You see this? This is exactly what I am talking about. People trying to play soldier." A few of the younger troops nodded, though not as confidently as before, their eyes flicking. between Carter and the old man. Something uncertain creeping in, something they could not quite name. And then the radio came alive again, not hesitant this time, not questioning, but direct. "Who is holding that patch?" the voice asked, and Carter hesitated for half a second before answering. "An older civilian, name unknown." Another pause, shorter, sharper, followed by a sound in the background of the transmission, movement, urgency, and then, "Do not remove that individual from the area." The voice said, each word precise. "Repeat, do not remove him." Carter felt his throat tighten, the weight in his chest shifting into something colder, something closer to realization, while Blake's smile faded just a fraction, subtle but there, as if the ground beneath his certainty had shifted without warning. "What is this? Some kind of mistake?" Blake muttered, but no one answered him, because at that exact moment, far across the base, the low rumble of an approaching engine began to rise. Distant at first, then building, steady and deliberate. And Carter turned his head toward the sound, knowing without being told that something had just changed in a way none of them were prepared for. While Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, the patch resting in his palm, his gaze still far away, as if whatever was coming had already happened once before, long ago, and he had simply been waiting for it to arrive again. The engine grew louder, no longer distant, but closing fast, a deep, mechanical hum rolling across the training ground until conversation stopped entirely and heads turned in unison, the dust along the perimeter lifting in slow spirals as a black Humvee cut across the access road with purpose, not speeding, not reckless, just controlled in a way that made it clear whoever was inside did not rush because they never needed to. And as it approached, the mood shifted again, sharper this time, heavier, like something official had just entered the space without warning. Blake straightened instinctively, his earlier confidence tightening into something more rigid, more uncertain, while Carter lowered his radio slowly, eyes fixed on the vehicle as it came to a precise stop. Less than 30 feet away, the engine idling low like a restrained force, and for a second nothing happened. No doors opened, no voices called out, just silence layered over the heat and the faint rattle of loose gravel. And then the driver's side door opened with a clean, deliberate motion, and Colonel Marcus Hale stepped out, his uniform crisp, his presence immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The kind of authority that did not need to announce itself because everyone felt it the moment it arrived. Conversations died completely now, replaced by a stillness that spread outward like a ripple, boots shifting into position, shoulders squaring without command. And Blake took a step forward, his voice measured but noticeably tighter than before. "Sir, we have a situation under control." But the colonel did not look at him, not even for a second, his eyes moving past the formation, scanning once, then locking onto Ethan Cole, standing alone with the patch still in his hand. And something changed in the colonel's expression, subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that did not belong to this moment alone. And he began walking forward, each step steady, unhurried, the distance closing with a quiet inevitability that made every second stretch. Carter felt it in his chest, that same tightening, that same sense that whatever this was, it was far beyond a simple misunderstanding. And as the colonel approached, the details became clearer, his gaze dropping briefly to the patch, then back to Ethan's face, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before he arrived. Blake shifted again, attempting to reassert control. "Sir, this individual was wearing unauthorized insignia and refused to identify himself." But the words sounded thinner now, weaker against the weight of the moment, and still the colonel said nothing, stopping just a few feet away from Ethan, close enough to see the worn threads, the faded symbol, the history stitched into fabric that had outlasted time itself. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire field suspended between what had been and what was about to be understood, and then the colonel's hand lifted slightly, not toward Blake, not toward the formation, but toward the patch, his voice low when it finally came, carrying just enough to reach every ear without needing to rise. "Where did you get that?" And it was not a question asked in doubt, but in recognition, the kind that turned everything that had happened moments ago into something dangerously close to a mistake. None of them were prepared to face the question hung in the air. quiet but heavy, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Ethan Cole shifted his gaze forward, meeting Colonel Marcus Hale's eyes with a calm that did not belong to the present moment. "It was given to me," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that did not need volume to be heard, and the colonel's expression tightened just slightly, not in doubt, but in confirmation, as if a missing piece had just fallen into place. The wind moved again across the field, lifting fine dust around their boots, the kind of stillness settling in where even the smallest sound seemed amplified. Blake felt it now, the shift he could not control, his earlier confidence draining into something colder, something uncertain. "Sir, with respect, that insignia is not recognized under any current registry," he pressed, trying to anchor himself to protocol, to rules that had always made sense. But the colonel did not look at him, not even a glance. His attention fixed entirely on Ethan, studying him not as a stranger, but as someone he had heard about in rooms where names were not spoken lightly. Carter watched from the side, barely breathing, his instincts now fully awake, every detail aligning into something far larger than a training field. Misunderstanding. And then the colonel stepped closer, closing the final distance, his boots stopping just inches from Ethan. And for a moment neither of them spoke. Two men standing in silence that carried decades between them. The kind of silence that only existed when history stood face to face with the present. The colonel's eyes dropped briefly to the patch again, then rose, searching Ethan's face as if confirming what memory alone could not. "What was the designation?" he asked quietly. And Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the worn fabric before he answered. Not immediately, not rushed, but measured. "We did not have one they could write down," he said, and something in the colonel's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a straightening that was not for authority, but for respect, real respect, the kind that could not be commanded, only recognized. Behind them, the formation had gone completely still, every soldier now watching, not out of curiosity, but something closer to realization, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Blake's jaw tightened as he tried to process what he was seeing, what he was hearing, the pieces no longer fitting into the framework he understood. "Sir, I need clarification," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier edge, and this time the colonel did respond, though not by turning fully, just enough for his voice to carry back, calm, controlled, and final. "You already have it, Staff Sergeant," he said, and then his attention returned to Ethan, his hand lifting slowly, deliberately, not to command, not to correct, but to receive, and without hesitation, Ethan placed the patch into the colonel's palm, the gesture simple, quiet, but carrying something that none of the watching soldiers could yet define, and for a brief second, the colonel held it there, unmoving, his eyes tracing the worn threads, the faded lines, as if reading something written long before any of them had stood on this field. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, but it reached every corner of the silence that had taken hold. "I have not seen one of these in 30 years, he said, and the words did not explain anything, but they changed everything. The words settled over the field like a weight no one could shake. 30 years, not spoken as exaggeration, not as nostalgia, but as fact. And Colonel Marcus Hale's grip on the patch tightened ever so slightly, his thumb brushing over the worn stitching, as if confirming something only he could feel. The soldiers standing behind Blake shifted uneasily now, the earlier smirks gone, replaced by a silence that pressed in from all sides. Carter felt it most, the realization forming fully in his mind. This was not a forgotten piece of fabric. This was something buried, something that had not been meant to surface again. Blake swallowed, his posture stiffening as he tried to regain control. "Sir, if this is some kind of classified insignia, protocol requires," he began. But the colonel's hand lifted just enough to stop him without even turning around. A small gesture, effortless, and Blake's voice cut off immediately, the authority in that motion. Undeniable, final. The colonel then stepped back half a pace, creating space not for distance, but for perspective, his eyes lifting from the patch to Ethan once more, studying him with a depth that carried more than curiosity, more than recognition. Something closer to respect shaped by stories passed down in quiet rooms where names were spoken carefully. "You were not supposed to still have this," the colonel said, his tone low, not accusatory, but almost reflective, and Ethan gave a slight nod, the movement minimal but certain. Most of us were not supposed to still be here, he replied, and the words did not carry bitterness, only truth, simple and unadorned. And for a moment the field seemed to narrow, the present bending slightly around something older, something heavier. Carter felt his chest tighten again, the kind of feeling that told him he was standing too close to something important to fully understand. The colonel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly past Ethan, past the formation, as if seeing something that no longer existed in front of him. And then he looked back down at the patch, holding it now with both hands, not out of necessity, but out of care, the gesture. Deliberate, almost ceremonial. There were only a handful of units that carried markings like this, he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough for the others to hear, and the soldiers leaned in without moving, drawn in despite themselves. None of them were ever listed. He continued, and the statement hung there, incomplete but powerful. Blake's jaw tightened further, confusion now replacing confidence entirely. His understanding of rank, of structure, of order, all of it beginning to slip against something that did not follow the rules he had built his authority on. Sir, I have never seen anything like that in any official archive, he said, quieter now. And this time the colonel did turn slightly, just enough for his words to reach Blake directly. That is because you were not meant to, he said, not harsh, not dismissive, just factual, and Blake said nothing after that. Because there was nothing left for him to say. The moment had moved beyond him, beyond his control, beyond anything he could correct. The colonel then stepped forward again, closing the space once more, and carefully, deliberately, he extended the patch back toward Ethan, not handing it over casually, but offering it with both hands. The respect in the gesture unmistakable, and as Ethan took it, their eyes met again, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that no one else could fully see, something built on time, on memory, on things that did not need explanation. And then the colonel straightened, his posture shifting, not into command, but into acknowledgement, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire field, calm, clear, and undeniable. Stand at attention, he said, and the words were not directed at Ethan, but at everyone else. The command landed without force, yet carried absolute authority, and in less than a second the entire formation snapped into position, boots aligning, shoulders locking, every trace of earlier laughter erased as discipline took over instinct, the sharp rustle of uniforms cutting clean through the silence before everything stilled again, and in the center of it all Ethan Cole did not move, did not adjust, did not acknowledge the shift around him, because the command had not been meant for him. Colonel Marcus Hale stood facing him, posture straight but not rigid, the kind of stance reserved not for inspection but for recognition. And for a moment the colonel simply looked at him, not as a superior, not as an evaluator, but as someone measuring the distance between stories he had heard and the man standing in front of him now. Carter felt his breath slow, the tension in his chest turning into something heavier, more grounded. The realization that this moment was no longer about discipline or protocol, but something far older, far deeper. Blake stood frozen within the line, his earlier certainty completely gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost fragile, his eyes fixed forward but unfocused, as if trying to reconcile everything he thought he understood with what was unfolding in front of him. The colonel then lifted his right hand, not quickly, not sharply, but with a deliberate precision that drew every eye without needing to demand attention. And when his hand reached the brim of his cover, he held it there for a fraction of a second, a pause that stretched across the entire field, before completing the motion in a clean, unmistakable salute. Not casual, not symbolic, but exact, the kind of salute reserved for those who had earned something that could not be written into orders. And the effect was immediate. Carter felt it first, a jolt that ran through him as his own body reacted before thought could catch up, his hand rising into position along with the rest of the formation. Because once the colonel saluted, there was no hesitation left. The entire line followed in perfect unison, a wave of motion that ended in absolute stillness. Dozens of soldiers standing at attention, saluting a man who had not said a word to command it. Blake's hand rose as well, slower than the others, a fraction behind, but it reached the same position, his jaw set tight, eyes forward, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than any reprimand ever could. And through it all, Ethan remained as he was, holding the patch, his gaze steady, the wind brushing lightly against his jacket. The silence now complete, no engines, no movement, no sound except the faint rustle of air across the open ground. And then, after a long second, Ethan lifted his hand, not snapping into position, not mirroring the precision of the formation, but returning the salute in his own way, slower, measured, carrying something that did not need to match their form to hold its meaning. And when the colonel lowered his hand, the formation followed again, precise, controlled, but different now, the tension, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and the colonel took a single step closer, his voice low when he spoke, but it carried across the stillness with clarity. "This is not a decoration," he said, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "This is history." And no one moved, because for the first time they understood that what they were witnessing was not just a correction of a mistake, but the return of something that had never needed recognition to exist, only respect to be remembered. The silence did not break after the colonel's words. It deepened, settling over the formation like something earned rather than imposed. And for a few seconds no one moved, no one shifted. Even the wind seemed to slow, as if respecting the weight of what had just been said. Carter felt it in his chest again, but this time it was different. Not tension, not uncertainty, something steadier. Something that felt like understanding beginning to take shape, though not fully formed. Not yet. Blake stood, rigid in line, his posture perfect now, but inside the structure he had relied on was cracking in quiet ways. The rules he had enforced moments ago now felt incomplete, like a map missing entire sections, and he could not look at Ethan Cole the same way again, not after what he had just witnessed. The colonel remained where he was, his presence no longer commanding attention but holding it naturally, his gaze drifting briefly across the formation, taking in every face, every posture, as if marking the moment into memory. And then he spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough that every soldier heard him without effort. "Some units never made it into the records," he said, his tone steady, measured. "Not because they did not exist, but because what they did could not be written down." The words moved through the line like a quiet current, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just truth laid bare in a way that required no explanation. Carter's eyes flicked back to Ethan, watching him more closely now, noticing the small details he had missed before, the way he stood without tension, the way his gaze held steady without searching, the way he carried himself like someone who had already seen more than this moment could ever challenge. And for the first time, Carter understood why it had felt wrong earlier, why something had not aligned. It was not the patch alone, it was the man wearing it. Blake shifted slightly, barely noticeable, but enough that the movement broke his perfect stillness, and the colonel saw it, not turning fully, but acknowledging it with a slight tilt of his head. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice calm, not harsh, but carrying a weight that left no room for misunderstanding. Blake responded immediately, "Sir," his voice tight, controlled, and for a brief second the entire formation seemed to lean into the moment without moving, waiting, and the colonel continued, "Stand down from assumption," he said, each word precise, deliberate. "You enforce standards, but you do not define them." Blake held his position, absorbing the words, not as a reprimand shouted across a field, but as something quieter and far more permanent, a correction that would not fade with time. "Yes, sir," he answered, and this time there was no edge in his voice, no resistance, just acknowledgement. The colonel gave a slight nod, then turned his attention back to Ethan, the shift immediate, as if the rest of the field no longer required his focus. "You came back," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that carried its own meaning. Ethan's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something almost reflective. "I was passing through," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than explanation ever could. The colonel let out a quiet breath, a small exhale that seemed to release something held for years, and for a moment, he said nothing more. The two men standing there, not as strangers, not as ranks, but as points connected by something unseen by everyone else. And behind them, the formation remained still, but different now. The silence no longer empty, but filled with something that would stay long after this moment ended. The air remained still long after the colonel's last words faded, not because there was nothing left to say, but because no one dared to interrupt what had become something far larger than a simple moment on a training field. And Colonel Marcus Hale shifted his stance slightly, not stepping away, not breaking the connection, but grounding himself in the present again, his eyes steady on Ethan Cole, as if measuring time itself between who he had been and who stood before him now. They said none of you stayed visible. The colonel said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the formation without losing its weight. And Ethan gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. We were never meant to, he replied, the words simple, unforced, and yet they carried a truth that settled deep into everyone listening. Carter felt it again, that quiet pull of realization, the understanding that some stories were not told because they could not be, not because they did not matter. And behind him, the formation held its discipline, but the energy had shifted into something reflective, something that would not fade once dismissed. Blake remained still, but his eyes had changed, no longer fixed forward in blind certainty, but aware now, aware of the gap between authority and understanding. The colonel then looked down briefly at the patch in Ethan's hand once more, not to examine it again, but to acknowledge it, a final recognition, before lifting his gaze back to the man himself. There are names tied to that, he said, carefully, as if choosing each word with precision. Names that never made it home in any official way. And Ethan's expression did not shift, but there was something in his stillness that spoke louder than reaction. Something that confirmed without needing to elaborate, and for a moment the colonel seemed to consider saying more, explaining more, but he did not, because explanation was not what this moment required. Respect was, and nothing else would have carried the same weight. He then took a step back, just one, creating space again, not distance, but closure, and turned slightly toward the formation, his presence shifting back into command, though not the same as before, now layered with something quieter, deeper. Remember this, he said, his voice steady, controlled. Not everything that matters will be written down, and not everyone who served will look like what you expect. The words moved across the line with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, and Carter felt them settle into him, not as instruction, but as something he would carry long after this day ended. Blake lowered his gaze just slightly, a movement small enough to go unnoticed by most, but not by himself, a silent acknowledgement of a lesson that had not been given lightly. And then the colonel turned back to Ethan one final time, his posture no longer formal, but grounded, human. If you ever decide to stay longer than passing through, he said, his tone quieter now, almost personal, this place will know how to receive you. And Ethan met his gaze for a brief second, the same calm, the same steadiness. It already has, he answered. And with that, the moment shifted again, not ending, but settling into something complete, something understood without needing to be explained. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the field felt balanced again, not because the tension had vanished, but because it had been replaced by something far more enduring. The moment did not end with a command. It softened, like tension releasing its hold on the air, and for the first time since the colonel arrived, the field felt almost ordinary again. Almost, because something had changed in every person standing there, even if no one spoke it aloud. Colonel Marcus Hale gave a final nod, small and deliberate, before stepping back toward the waiting Humvee, his role shifting once more from witness to commander. But the respect remained, carried in the way he moved, in the way he did not rush, did not need to. The engine idled low as he reached the door, pausing for just a second as if marking the end of something unseen. Then he stepped in, and the vehicle pulled away, steady and controlled, the sound fading into the distance until only the quiet remained. And for a few seconds longer, no one moved. The formation still held, not by order, but by the weight of what had just happened, until finally Blake lowered his hand, the motion slower than it should have been, like he was relearning something he thought he already knew. The others followed, one by one, the sharp discipline returning, but not quite the same, not as rigid, something deeper now resting underneath it. Carter exhaled quietly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, his eyes drifting back to Ethan Cole, who now stood alone again, just as he had before any of this began, the patch resting back in his hand, its worn edges catching the light for a brief second before he carefully pressed it back onto his jacket, not fixing it perfectly, not adjusting it for appearance, just placing it where it belonged, the way it had always been. And when he finished, he did not look around, did not wait for acknowledgement. He simply turned, his steps unhurried as he walked across the edge of the training field, boots crunching softly against the gravel, the same quiet presence that had been there from the start, unchanged, untouched by the shift around him. Blake watched him go, not openly, not turning his head fully, but enough to follow the movement. Something unsettled and reflective settling into his posture. The earlier certainty gone, replaced by something far more difficult to define, something closer to respect. Carter stood still, eyes tracking Ethan until he reached the far side of the field, where the open road stretched beyond the base. And for a brief moment, the older man paused, not turning back, not acknowledging the dozens of eyes still on him, just standing there as the wind moved lightly across the ground. And then he kept walking, steady, consistent, until distance slowly took him out of view. And only then did the field begin to move again. Quiet conversation starting, low and uncertain, the kind that